So hello everybody. So in my part of the world, it's evening already. I've been UTC +2. Spent a nice long busy day teaching SANS 4508 course, the Advanced Incident Response and Threat Hunting course. And today I've basically been asked to have a chat to everybody who is attending today about the importance of foundational skills in digital forensics. Oh, pardon me. So I suppose before we get started, I suppose a good idea to just a little brief bio background about me. So I've been in working in digital forensics and incident response now for the last 22 years. In fact, I'm almost close to finishing my 23rd year in this field. So, you know, obviously you'll note from the picture, my hair looks somewhat gray. It wasn't always that. In fact, there's a picture of me floating around outside the FBI Academy in Quantico with a very full head of very, very luscious brown hair. You know, obviously before the stresses and trials and tribulations of digital forensics started to take its toll. 17 of the years that I've been doing digital forensic incident response was in law enforcement. I've spent, I've spent a lot of time in court over the course of my career, both in criminal matters, in civil matters. You know, and I've seen kind of both sides of everything, and it's been a real interesting journey from a digital forensics perspective. One thing to be said about digital forensics that kind of talks to a lot about what we talked about in this presentation is how the world of digital forensics has actually changed, you know, and also how we've tried to respond to those changing dynamics in the field of digital forensics. I do a lot of digital forensics research. I am, aside from teaching for SANS and being a practicing digital forensic practitioner, I also teach at several universities, and you know, I'm very, very sort of active in the field of research as well, and I try and sort of publish at least 2 or 3 you know, research papers a year. Currently for SANS, I've been teaching for SANS now for 6 years. I regularly teach the 4500 Windows Forensics class and the 4508 Advanced Incident Response and Threat Hunting class. And I've recently, along with my co-authors, Catherine Headley and Philip Moore, have been working along with SANS to develop the 4308 course, which is the Digital Forensics Essentials course. And it's one of the topic areas we're going to talk about in today's webcast. I've been doing this for a long time, and I still get an absolute thrill with the work that I do. I don't feel that a single day in the office is boring. In fact, I kind of feel like it's almost a crime that I get paid to do what I do because I love doing what I do so much. I mean, this is, it's like I get to do my hobby. I get to do the thing that I love doing most, and make a living from it. And one of the thrills that I get from still doing this work is the thrill of the chase, the thrill of the hunt, the following of the clues, the following of the leads, the building of the cases. You know, whether it's, you know, actually, you know, identifying a bad guy and leading to a prosecution of that person, or at least the identification of how a particular attack took place and being able to remediate it correctly. It's all part of the process, and I absolutely love it. And I suppose it's almost goes without saying that I'm the nerd's nerd. I like to think of myself almost as like the alpha nerd, you know, one of those guys that can truly quote just about every line from, you know, from all 9 Star Wars movies. I guess that's me. And you know, the reason for this webcast, in fact, the reason for a lot of the work that we've been doing around the 308 course that we've developed is to really address a very critical need within the digital forensics and incident response space. Now, I'm not the most handy person in the world. You know, I can kind of get by with my hands. You know, I'm probably better with you know, hands on a keyboard and doing all sorts of cool technical stuff. But I was never destined to be a builder or a carpenter or anything along those lines, and I had absolutely sucky skills like that at school. But one of the things that's always been sort of drilled into me, as a young kid at school, going, learning how things are done, is that when you build a house, it always has to have a solid foundation. And when I got to see my own home built, I got to see the importance of that foundation. I got to see the importance of why it has to be done. And having friends who are civil engineers, I've got to get a real appreciation of that sense of foundational knowledge in all things. And the reality is that if we build any kind of construction, if we build anything on a shaky foundation, the first time that we're going to find ourselves in any kind of negative situation or any kind of situation where we face some type of adversity, that building is literally going to collapse in on itself. And this is most often illustrated through the concept of building a house on sand. Sand just simply doesn't make a good foundation. It's weak, it's prone to movement, and that's what happened. Now, we use this as an analogy in looking at digital forensics, because if we look sometimes at how digital forensic skills are taught around the world, a lot of times the emphasis is on teaching how to do things. So again, if I think of the very sort of first digital forensics courses that I'd ever done in my career, and again, this is, I grew up in a period of digital forensics where initially there weren't really lots of courses. We kind of made it up as we went along and helped develop the field. But all of a sudden, along came all of these different courses. You had all the different vendors that were teaching forensic courses. You had, if you were from, if you were if sort of an FTK user, Access Data was producing courses. If you were an NCase user, guidance software was producing courses, and pretty much every vendor out there that ran some kind of digital forensics or had some kind of digital forensics tool produced a course. Now, I'm pretty sure that the comments that I'm going to mention here are probably going to be, they may be offensive to some people who've done those courses, and they may be even offensive maybe to some vendors. And it's not meant to be, it's just a simple reality of the situation, that a lot of these training courses that have been out there for so long have really focused on teaching you how to do things with tools. Now, the best way I can sort of think of that is if you learn to drive a car, but you don't learn all the critical skills, like it's basically the manufacturer of the car coming up to you and say, you know what, all you need to know is you need to put the key in the ignition, you need to know how to turn it on, you need to know how to turn the steering wheel, you need to know how to use the indicators, you need to know how to turn the lights on, and how to use the brake and accelerator and the clutch. And if you do those things, that's okay. You don't need to know everything else. You don't need to know about how often the car needs to be maintained. You don't need to know about tire pressure. You don't need to know about any of that stuff, because that's not really important to driving. You just need to know how to move forward. And unfortunately, that's what we see with a lot of the sort of digital forensics training that's existed for a large extent around the world, is it's teaching us how to do stuff. There's been such a pressing need to be able to deal with digital evidence that it's just been about getting stuff done. Now, when I did, my very sort of first exposure to SANS, SANS had what was then the 508 course. So I was looking, in my career, I was looking around. I wanted to further my education in digital forensics. I was craving some kind of formalized training, and one of the first courses that I came across was the old SANS 508 course, and this was a 1-week course, but it was different in the sense that it covered some of the fundamentals. It dealt with file systems, dealt with a whole bunch of cool stuff. But that was several years ago, and digital forensics, the entire digital forensics incident response field, has dramatically changed since then. So so I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, which is basically where do we focus on the type of house that we want to build. You know, we don't want to build this shoddy, or I won't say shoddy, but we don't want to build this house that's an amazing house, but it's built on a soft foundation. So we've got these amazing skills, but the first time that those skills are slightly rattled, everything collapses. So when I looked at the original SANS 508 class, I was really impressed. And these courses started to develop, and suddenly the 508 class split into two classes. We had the 408 focusing on Windows forensics, and we had the 508. And then we developed network forensics and mobile forensics and reverse engineering of malware. You know, our most recent courses being the 498, the battlefield forensics and forensic acquisitions courses, our 308 course, the forensic essentials. And what we started to realize is that there was a lot more to digital forensics than just simply doing stuff. And there was a whole bunch of foundational skills you needed to deal with. However, like in any educational environment, you respond to the most immediate needs of the people that need training, and still one of the most immediate needs for most organizations is how to do stuff. So, you know, if we were looking at doing digital forensics in an organization where we were primarily doing incident response or supporting internal investigations, we would want those immediate skills that we could use right away. You know, if we were doing digital forensics in a law enforcement environment, we needed those immediate skills right away to solve this case. So the focus is in a lot of digital forensics training around the world has really been in these technical areas. And where I realized that we were potentially missing out on things is, you know, I would engage with students that I was teaching around the world, and they would ask me questions like, you know, Jason, that case you spoke about in class, how did we get there? How did you get there? How did you solve the case? It wasn't just about finding the evidence. You had to construct the case. You had to build the narrative. You had to follow the breadcrumbs, so to speak. And it was that sort of realization that a lot of digital forensics practitioners out there haven't always had the opportunity to pick up all of the different levels of skills and foundational skills that are required for a successful career in digital forensics. And unfortunately, this has led to some very well-known and somewhat tragic cases over the years. Now I've selected a few just, you know, that are probably fairly well known, but just to give you an idea of some of the consequences of actually having poor foundational skills in digital forensics and incident response. So one of the first cases that I'd sort of seen this happen was the case of Julie Amero in the United States. And this was a teacher who, you know, one day was literally sitting in her classroom, you know, showing presentations of that via the internet. And all of a sudden, a whole bunch of pornography popped up on the screen, and she was charged with, I can't remember the exact charge, but it's basically she was, you know, contributing to the delinquency of minors and things along those lines. And she was prosecuted, and the authorities brought in a digital forensics practitioner who just got things hopelessly wrong. Now, again, it's sometimes easy to be a sort of an armchair referee and look at something that's happened in the past and turn around and say, you know what, that person should have done it better. That person should have had more knowledge, should have had more expertise, should have had more understanding. But in many instances, remember that the people that are doing this kind of work are limited to what their organizations have made available to them. So if I look at the case of Julie Amero, she was prosecuted, she faced a prison sentence, she lost her teaching license. The effects on her personally were absolutely huge. And if you think about it, I mean, one of the things that we as a society are so truly sensitive about is any kind of criminality or crime that potentially endangers children. You know, so when we talk about child exploitation matters, I know I know a lot of people almost trivialize it and talk about child pornography, but you can't call it child pornography. You've got to call it what it is, and that's exploited child exploitation material. And the reality is that the fact that she had been prosecuted, the fact that she'd been arrested for this sort of salacious act of exposing children to pornography, the community was just like absolutely appalled. I mean, how can you do this to children? And unfortunately, the case got a lot of traction, and she pleaded her innocence over and over and over. And to cut a long story short, eventually she did see justice in the sense that she was granted a new trial. Other people looked at the evidence, and she eventually pleaded to a misdemeanor, effectively for her negligence. But the reality is that she should never have actually been put in that position in the first place. The zealousness of doing the investigation, coupled with poor technical foundations, actually ended up meaning that the forensic examiner who did the case just simply got things hopelessly wrong. Well, that's all good and well. I mean, that's a clear-cut criminal prosecution. It's easy to talk around and say, well, there's somebody that was nailed. Well, again, here's a case on the civil litigation side, which is a lot more recent, probably more closer to home for especially a lot of people doing incident response. And this was the fairly recent case of the Vegas casino that basically ended up suing Trustwave because Trustwave had done an incident response. They had said that the incident had been remediated and fixed. And not too long after that, the attack group had basically recompromised the casino, and an investigation by Mandiant actually came along and said, actually, the previous investigation didn't pick up all of these things. Now, again, obviously, with a lot of this, we don't know the exact ins and outs of specifically what happened in the case. Not every aspect of the investigation has been made public knowledge. But you've got to ask yourself, how did we get to this point that an organization such as Trustwave, which is really a reputable company, could have made a mistake like this? If this can happen to a company like Trustwave, who else could it happen to? And again, I've seen this in a number of instances of some of the cases that we've investigated where we've gone in as the incident responders, and there's been previous people working on the case, and they've issued reports, and you look at the reports and you look at the evidence, and you're like, how is this possible? This is so wrong. Now, again, I'm not saying that anybody is being malicious and getting things wrong on purpose, but we have to be concerned that so many things are happening wrong, and there are consequences to those actions. This is a case, unfortunately, that is very near and dear to my heart, because I was actually in Orlando, Florida, during the whole trial for the Casey Anthony case, and again, this is an example of a case where somebody who was, for all intents and purposes, very likely responsible for the killing of her daughter was found not guilty by a jury of her peers. And one of the key issues about her being found not guilty was some of the issues that had to take place with the evidence, which also included the digital evidence. Now both of the police detectives in this case that dealt with the digital evidence are really good forensic practitioners. I know both of them personally, and they are really good at their work. But there were issues, some foundational issues about maybe, they were too reliant on the tools that they used and didn't understand necessarily how to do some of the deep dive technical work around some of the data structures. Again, this is not a criticism of them, because I think in many instances their work has been absolutely impeccable. But it's always that one case that something happens that can quickly cause some downfall. Now, here's another case that I just want to talk about that I have personal knowledge of, and it's a case that I actually talk about on the 308 course. But I was called in to look at some evidence on a case where a man had been dismissed from his workplace. He'd been dismissed for allegedly viewing pornographic images in the workplace in violation of their user policy, acceptable use policy, and he was fired. Now, obviously, this is in a fairly conservative community. You know, him getting fired for viewing porn at work had a massive impact on him. You know, people were looking at him weirdly. The people in his church, like, sort of, you know, frowned upon any activities with him. His whole family took strain, and he maintained his innocence all along. Now, again, this particular company, in doing this investigation, had brought in some IT specialists who claimed they could do some digital forensics work and incident response work. And what they did is they got to the environment, they pulled the web server logs, and they just had this whole list of pornographic websites that this guy's user account had gone to. And they're like, that's it, evidence is done and dusted, and they charged the company a fair buck for their efforts. I got called in by his lawyer and said, look, you know, my client basically says that this guy, you know, that he's innocent, he didn't do this stuff, you know, he's been fired, he now wants to take the court. And he basically then took the company to court for unlawful dismissal. And through the entire investigation process, you know, obviously we went through a process of discovery. I got access to his computer, got access to the evidence that they alleged to have against him. And the first thing I noticed in looking at the evidence against him, which was from the web server logs, was there was all of these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of websites, these pornographic websites. And trust me, you could clearly see they were pornographic websites for the name of the websites. I didn't have to go and like physically go and check every single website. But when you looked at the timestamps, like there were literally hundreds of timestamps with exactly the identical timestamp. Like, that's just not possible. It's not possible for a human being to click on these kind of things. So we went and looked at the evidence, and ultimately what we found is that he had been on a website prior to this whole porn website issue, which I suppose you could say was a bit of a risque website, but not pornographic. And that website had been compromised, and he was basically subjected to a drive-by download, which loaded a piece of malware into memory on his browser, and it basically caused cascading pop-ups. So it would be on the page, it would open up a link to every, you know, it would open up a browser tab for every single link on that web page, and then for every page it was open, it would do the same thing over and over and over. And 2 steps away from the page he was on ended up on a porn website, and that basically just went crazy from there, and everything was porn after that. Now, this poor guy got fired. He got vilified in his community. He had his reputation stained. His kids and family were mercilessly teased because, you know, hey, you know, your dad's a pervert. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, this guy hadn't done anything wrong because the actual people initially doing the digital forensics simply got things wrong. So the reality is there are massive consequences for doing digital forensics poorly. Now, there's obviously consequences for the victim, if I can put it that way. But there's also consequences for you as a digital forensics practitioner, because let's be quite blunt about it. When the brown stuff hits the fan, it's not the organization that's going to take the fall. It's you as the individual examiner. People are going to turn around and say, you messed up. And they're very quick to basically turn around and fire you or get rid of you or take action against you. So at the end of the day, we as digital forensics practitioners have to be honest with ourselves in understanding that, you know, to do digital forensics, we need to go beyond what we've traditionally thought digital forensics is about. And one of the things that we need to realize, and I think this is very pertinent to the discussion about foundational skills, is that digital forensics is way more than just using digital forensics tools. It's way more than using EDR solutions. It's way more than using incident response tools. It is a very detailed, multidisciplinary field that requires skill and expertise in a whole bunch of different areas. And unfortunately what we see is that in many instances we don't address the fundamental knowledge areas in our field. So we end up with these big gaps in our foundational knowledge, and as soon as that gets tested in the crucible of a legal process, it falls apart. And unfortunately, then the consequences is on you as a digital forensics practitioner, because you'll be left holding the bag. So I basically tried to break down digital forensics and incident response into sort of 5 core knowledge areas. So the first 2 knowledge areas are going to be our digital forensics and incident response. Then we're going to talk about sort of investigative and criminological behavior activities. We're going to talk about procedural issues. Then we're going to talk about some of the legal issues. And all 5 of those things are part of your core foundational skills that you need. So when it comes to digital forensics is based on a science, and that science is computer science. So while a lot of digital forensics training is really, really good at teaching you how to interpret artifacts or understand certain tools or how to use certain tools, do we necessarily know about data? Do we understand how data is structured? Do we understand numbering systems? Do we understand how to count the way a computer counts? Do we understand common terms and techniques? So if we're talking about things like a sort of a programming array, or even just talking about an array in general, do we know what that means? Again, we can't be doing digital forensics if we don't have a core understanding of the underlying technology that we're dealing with. So a core aspect of digital forensics, which we don't often cover in digital forensics courses, is the basics of data, the basics of file systems. So it's very important that if you're going to be doing digital forensics, you need to understand those processes, because if you don't understand those processes, you're potentially leaving yourself open for attack because you don't understand how things work. One of the key things when it comes to some of the core fundamental processes in digital forensics, or those foundational knowledge things, is actually the digital forensics process. How does it work? What are the processes we look at in digital forensics? We've seen massive developments in digital forensics as a field through the development of things like the Scientific Working Group on Digital Evidence, which has developed a whole bunch of guidelines and processes and procedures around digital forensics. We've really seen it amped up to the next level now, where we look at the development of ISO standards on digital forensics. And this is great because we're now starting to elevate digital forensics to almost like a rightful place as a fully blown forensic science. So you need to understand those processes to understand what digital forensics is all about. And obviously another aspect that's absolutely critical from a foundational point of view in digital forensics, and something that we touch upon in a lot of courses, is how do you validate your forensic tools? How do you actually test them? Do you understand the testing processes? Do you understand the testing protocols? Do you understand even what protocols are out there to test your tools? Because you can't just rely on the fact, and we see this quite often. We'll have sort of vendors turn around in their marketing campaign saying, we have this this court-approved tool. No, you don't. There is no such thing as a court-approved tool. And you need to understand that, because you need to be able to argue that point later. And again, this is the type of stuff that you don't necessarily get to do in a lot of general digital forensics training, because we're so focused on teaching people how to do things and get things done. So that's kind of some of the core issues we need to cover when it comes to digital forensics. But we also need to understand that a key aspect of the work we do at DFIR, especially if in the commercial environment, is the whole aspect of incident response. So, if you're going to do incident response work, it's not just good enough, for example, for you to be able to get onto a network that you're busy doing, an intrusion matter on, or responding to an incident on, and start, whipping off machines and remediating and triaging and all of those type of things. And you can use all these different tools to do this work. But do you understand some of the core business issues? Do you understand some of the risk dynamics? For example, are you even aware of some of the legal ramifications that you might need? Why an organization may need certain policies and procedures in place before an incident actually takes place? Or do you understand the fundamental principles in incident response as a discipline? Because similar to what we've seen with digital forensics, we now have ISO standards for incident response. So again, we're starting to develop these formalized professional frameworks to do particular activities. Now, again, if you're going to do digital incident response incorrectly, maybe with all the best intentions, but you make mistakes along the way, there are consequences for those actions. The organization that you're working for may get sued. Action might be taken against you. The organization that you're doing work for might be compromised again. They may suffer irreparable damage. Your lack of thoroughness in your investigation might end up in that company actually being shut down and going out of business. These are real concerning issues that we need to be able to address. So if we're going to do incident response work, which is kind of part of this DFIR process, we need to understand those issues. But we also need to go one step beyond that, because generally when we're dealing with an incident, that usually happens because there's been some kind of failure in security. And there's been some kind of failure in security in response to the information system. So do you understand information systems? Do you understand how networks work? Do you understand the sort of core security processes, protocols, and principles? You can't just be an incident responder if you don't understand those issues. Can you effectively advise your client on what's necessary to make things better from a security point of view? So I think it's very important, again, in terms of developing these foundational skills, that we need to consider those as well. Now, in my opinion, you can't do digital forensics or incident response without an investigative mindset. Now, this is an area that's very near and dear to my heart. And I've been doing a lot of research over the years around what makes a good investigator, what kind of mindset you need to have to be an effective investigator. And if you are doing digital forensics and incident response, that's exactly what you are. You are first and foremost an investigator. There is a mystery that needs to be solved. And the reality is there is a fair amount of foundational knowledge happening at both an understanding of deductive and inductive thinking, an understanding of how to build logical arguments, an understanding of investigative processes. It's all critical to allow you to be an investigator. Now, what do I mean by this? Again, a lot of digital forensics training teaches you how to do stuff, but it doesn't necessarily talk to the why you do stuff, or the how you build a case, or how you follow the clues and the leads. And I've seen it in a lot of times that I've taught courses around the world where suddenly you present students with a case, and again, these can be students with amazing technical skills. You're like, okay, something bad's happened, and literally everything just grinds to a halt, because you literally are faced with so much data, you don't know where to start. You don't know how to build the case. You don't know the kind of questions you should ask. You don't know the kinds of thinking processes you should employ. So if you're going to be doing digital forensics and incident response, it's really important to understand those fundamental thought processes. It's important to understand how to build a case. Again, it really doesn't matter whether I'm doing a forensics matter or I'm responding to an incident, that the sort of thinking processes and principles are exactly the same. I remember sort of many years ago when I was doing my detective training, that it was sort of something that was drummed into me as a young detective. You know, you teach a person to think the right way, and you can see this. You can see this throughout the world with really successful investigative agencies, that are renowned for their good detectives, because they found a way to train investigative thought. And again, this is one of these fundamentals that we need to deal with in digital forensics and incident response, because if you're thinking along the correct lines and you're asking the correct questions, you'll get the correct answers. So that's a big issue, at least from my perspective, when it comes to a core fundamental skill in digital forensics and why it's so important. So the other thing that's very important, again, part of this multidisciplinary approach with digital forensic incident response, is understanding the procedures, the processes, how to document things. There is this old Latin saying which says, and I can't remember the exact Latin phrase, but basically it translates to ignorance of the law is no excuse. And the reality is that any time you do digital forensics and incident response work, there is always the possibility that you're going to end up in court. There is always that possibility. You have to accept it, even if you turn around and say, you know what, we have no intention of going to court. Because think about it. I might not intend taking a case to court, but somebody else might take me to court because of that case. And I'd still required to have that evidence. So the law's not going to turn around and say, hey, you know what, sorry, Jason, you didn't know about all of this technicalities and procedural stuff, so we're just going to let it slide. No, they're not, because again, the law can't accept the fact that you could just be ignorant of it. There's no excuse to that. So it's really important as a digital forensics practitioner, as an incident responder, that you're aware of the procedural environment or the regulatory environment that you find yourself in. Again, we see this happening all over the world with the introduction of privacy regulations. We saw it recently in Europe with the introduction of GDPR. More regulation, more processes, more procedures. I look at, for example, instances in the United States, in certain states, where if you want to do digital forensics work, you have to be a licensed private investigator. These are some of those regulatory issues that you need to be aware of. So if you're going to practice in the field of digital forensics, you have to understand those processes. You have to understand those things. And again, a lot of digital forensics training doesn't focus on that because, let's be honest, being able to fill out a chain of custody form is not as exciting as being able to reverse engineer a really cool piece of malware. But at the end of the day, your ability to reverse that cool piece of malware is not going to matter one iota if on the day that you actually need to present the evidence relating to this amazing technical skill that you've displayed, if you can't have produced or presented to the court in such a way that they can believe that evidence has validity. So at a foundational level, you really need to understand those processes. And the final area in terms of fundamental skills and why it's so important for you as a digital forensics practitioner is you need to understand the law. Now I know a lot of people turn around and say, but Jason, we technical people, we don't really want to get into this law thing. Well, unfortunately, you cannot disentangle the law from digital forensics and incident response. These disciplines are intrinsically linked, whether you like it or not. So it's absolutely important for you as a digital forensics practitioner at a foundational level to at least have a fundamental understanding of how the law works. Now, again, in a course like 308, which is taught around the world, we can't teach every single law from every single country. but there are some core universal jurisprudence and legal truths that apply in every single country around the world. So understanding the difference between criminal law and civil law, understanding things like burden of proof, these are fundamental knowledges. Being able to read a piece of law and understand it with meaning, these are some of the foundational skills that you need. And obviously, coupled with those foundational skills in law, probably one of the most underrated and underappreciated skills when it comes to digital forensics is actually the ability to present the evidence, to present the results of your work before a court of law. Do you know how to testify? Are you comfortable to testify? The reality is that if you can't do that, you're potentially going to find yourself suffering, and unfortunately your career could suffer as a result. So I want to share another case again where this has happened, and I felt incredibly bad for this particular individual. I'd been involved in an investigation where well, to cut a long story short, I was acting for the defense in this particular case, and I need to share, I sometimes find it weird acting for the defense, but I also need to remember that as a forensic professional, my obligation is to the court, and my obligation is to the truth. My obligation is not to one side or the other. It's to objectively deal with the evidence at hand. And in this particular case, the forensic practitioner for the state, or this police officer that was doing the case, very nice guy. I've got a lot of time for him. He's a really pleasant guy, but he made some critical misinterpretations around the evidence, particularly around interpreting certain evidence in the registry. And again, it wasn't necessarily his fault. He had relied on a digital forensics tool to present the evidence to him, and he had made a statement based on that evidence alone. And obviously, I as part of my forensic analysis of the evidence, I had to produce an expert report, which was fairly comprehensive. And the judge in the case obviously had his report and had my report, and he was on the witness stand before I was. And I felt so bad, especially reading the court transcript, because obviously I wasn't allowed to be there during his evidence in chief, because the judge ripped him apart. I mean, the judge literally ripped him apart because I had pointed out the issues that were of concern in his analysis, because he'd relied on a tool that had presented things incorrectly. Now, again, I don't blame the poor police officer for doing this. He had not been provided the training he needed. He'd been plucked out of the unit that he was working and put into a digital forensics unit without the appropriate qualifications and expertise. Again, because adverse finding in court against that individual, his ability to testify in court going forward was severely curtailed. And you can't help but feel bad for somebody in that position, like, not because of their own fault, but simply because they didn't know better. And this is why it's important to deal with these foundational issues. Now, the genesis of the 308 course, which we introduced, or SANS introduced this year, really culminated out of discussions with myself and with a whole bunch of SANS instructors around the world, where our students would literally come up to us during a training session and say, Jason, are we going to cover how to testify in court in this case, or in this course? Or Jason, are we going to talk about like some of the core fundamentals of file systems in this course? Because obviously those of us who've been doing digital forensics for a long time, and who've obviously taken the time and effort to build up these fundamentals, we kind of know these things. But we've realized that there's a lot of people coming into the industry that simply don't have that fundamental knowledge level, and we realized there was a need to actually provide that. Because if you wanted to have a well-rounded forensic professional, they needed to have that solid foundation. So again, coming back to this building a house on sand, you can build the best house. So you can have absolutely all the best technical training in the world. But if your foundations are not solid, as soon as you are exposed to that tsunami, for lack of a better term, of being in court and being rigorously questioned under cross-examination, it's kind of easy to fall because your foundation is not strong. And if your foundation is strong, you can pretty much weather that storm pretty well, and you can get out of it pretty comfortably. So as I said, in conjunction with a lot of SANS instructors, myself, Catherine Headley, and Phil Moore, we're tasked with developing our 308 course. Now, what do we cover in the 308 course? How does the 308 course help provide those fundamentals, those foundation aspects that are so critical for your success in digital forensics? Well, probably I think one of the most important things that we cover in terms of broad topics is really what do we mean by digital investigation? It's such a broad field with so many uses and so many applications that it's important to understand what we can do, what we can't do, because with all due respect to TV forensics, it doesn't really work like that in the real world. But yet we still find people who believe that that's the norm. So again, as a foundation level course, it really covers all of those fundamental aspects as to what digital investigation is. And then we specifically cover two very critical aspects. Is we really look at the core fundamentals of what digital forensics is, looking at all the core processes, methodologies, techniques, and things like that. And we do the same thing for incident response. That at the end of the day, a student that's worked through the course understands all of those core processes. And once you understand those core processes, you could take any one of the other digital forensics courses or incident response courses within the SANS digital forensics curriculum, and you'll have that solid foundation. You'll know how to apply all those techniques that we cover in those courses. And then we cover two really, really critical areas which are fundamental to good digital forensics. We deal with how do we get the evidence correctly. Now, when I say how to get the evidence correctly, we're not talking about we're going to teach you like everything about imaging. We've got our 498 course for that, which covers that. But this is really getting to grips with core concepts in how do we get evidence, understanding why we do certain techniques the way we do it, and so on. And then we really focus in on the investigation and analysis side of it. The thinking processes. How do we think about cases? How do we approach certain problems? How do we build our cases? How do we get the answers that we need? And we spend a fair amount of time teaching those thought processes and practices. We then also look at again, how do we present our digital evidence? So how do we document everything? How do we write reports? How do we present our evidence in court? We look at some of the legal aspects of digital evidence, admissibility issues, and we spend a fair amount of time covering the effectiveness of how to testify in court. Because again, you could be the best technical digital forensics or incident response person in the world, but if you fail in the courtroom, it doesn't matter how great your technical expertise was. So it's important to cover those fundamentals. And lastly, we look at issues around how to look at forensic readiness, how to help prepare an organization for utilizing digital evidence, how to manage a digital forensics unit or to manage digital forensics cases. Again, because there's a lot of differences and nuances that we get in those kind of environments that we don't necessarily get in other things. So the 408 course basically provides those missing pieces in an overall digital forensics curriculum. So we now, again, if I look at where we are from a digital forensics curriculum perspective, I'm very excited because we literally now have almost an end-to-end digital forensics career path within the digital forensics curriculum. You can get somebody coming in that really wants to get into digital forensics. They can start by building a strong foundation and then building on the technical skills. But at the same token, this is not necessarily a course meant just for somebody who's never done digital forensics before. I mean, you might be an absolutely brilliant SOC analyst, or you might be a brilliant reverse engineer, but you need to still learn these fundamentals, especially if there's that prospect that you're going to end up going to court and having to be cross-examined about this kind of evidence. Please have a look at the 308 course if you really want to help bolster your foundational skills in digital forensics. Talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues. It can be really quite useful. If anybody does have any questions about the material, or just generally wants to talk about how to get into digital forensics in general, some of the things that you could do, how to find mentors in the field, how to contribute more to the community, or become more actively involved in the community, you are more than welcome to drop me an email. Aside from my personal email, you can also reach out to me on my SANS email. So it's just jjordan@sans.org, or you can reach out to me on Twitter, and please ask away, ask any questions. This is something that I'm very passionate about in terms of making sure that digital forensics practitioners have these foundational skills, because at the end of the day, it just takes that one case in court, or that one report, or that one adverse finding against you, and it can literally sink a person's career. And there are amazing people in the digital forensics community. I mean, I was listening to Jessica Hyde talk to my best friend Veronica Schmidt earlier today on another webcast, and again, it sort of strikes me just how inclusive our community is, and how much we actually care for each other. We want to make sure that we all succeed. And this is why it's important to just be honest with ourselves sometimes, that sometimes we don't have those foundational skills that we need. And we don't, unfortunately, sometimes realize we need those foundational skills until it's too late. So I hope you've all enjoyed the webcast. I'm going to hand over back to Carol to see if there's any questions. If there are any questions, I'll take time to answer. I think we've still got like 7 minutes or so to go, so I have left a little bit of time for questions. And again, if anybody doesn't want to answer questions during this session, they're more than welcome to reach out to me offline, and I will happily engage with conversation with you on any topic that you want. So Carol, I'm going to hand over back to you.
All right, thanks so much, and thanks for providing an alternate way to ask questions, because I do think we have too many to get through for our Q&A. So
wow, okay.
What do you need to use for an IPv6 network?
Okay, I'm not sure if I understand the question. It's like, what do you need to use for an IPv6 network? I'm going to assume you're talking about from an investigative point of view. Well, again, if you're just trying to track down who owns a particular IP address, most of your WHOA systems are already configured to deal with IPv6. I'm not sure if that's what the exact scope of the question is, but if you want to refine the question, please, if you just like maybe give a refinement to Carol, and I'll happily answer that in a more complete way.
Yeah, thanks. So the person, there's something below it, and maybe it's referencing this.
Okay, cool.
It says, if you don't know the scope of the problem, some people take shortcuts, and then the person did also add larger scope. I don't know if that helps or not. Maybe they could rephrase the whole question.
So that's, I mean, I kind of think I get the thing. I mean, one of the big things, the big challenges we get in doing digital forensics, and again, this is where the foundation comes in, is you walk into an organization. Let's take, there's been a compromise, and somebody says to us, we think something bad's happened, can you go find it? And you're facing like 10,000 endpoints. Like, well, where do you start? And oftentimes that's where those investigative skills come into play. So it's like actually interviewing people, talking to them, looking for clues, looking for patterns of behavior and activity. And then the other aspect, and again, this is also where the investigative skills come into play, is you have this tendency sometimes to get scope creep. So the case just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and people want you to do more and more and more. But if I've been tasked to do a particular investigation, if I know the constraints and the limitations of my investigation, I can stay on target and I can get the result a lot more effectively. Because again, if you, the moment once you go down that rabbit hole of digital evidence, I guarantee you, unless you have a focused investigative plan, you are going to get lost. I'll put money on it. You're going to get yourself lost. So that understanding of those investigative mindsets and those investigative skills become so critical.
All right, thanks. So how do you get to that base knowledge set without reinvesting tens of thousands of dollars and time into more training in a computer science course or degree?
So yeah, obviously I should say, well, you need to come and do the SANS 308 course, but let's be quite pragmatic about it. Not everybody has the opportunity to do something like that. So what I generally recommend is that if you've realized there is a gap in your core foundational knowledge, just go and read. There's a lot of resources. Read a good book on investigative processes. So there's a book that I read many years ago, I think it's still in print, called Process of Investigation. It's towards internal investigation. It talks through the investigative mindset so well. If you're looking at core computing skills, there's lots of different books out there on that. I got a book last year sometime, and I actually got it for my son, called Computer Science Distilled. And it basically looks at computational problem solving. And so there's lots of things that you can do that don't cost a huge amount of money to boost your foundational knowledge. And the reason I say that is, a lot of us old farts that have been doing forensics for a long time, like when we started doing, I can look at my own career journey. When I started doing, when I joined law enforcement, you didn't go do computer science degrees. That was just like, you just don't do that. Obviously, I'd been a computer nerd for a long time, but I didn't go and study a computer science degree initially. I did my law enforcement studies. It was only much later on in my career that I that I went back and did a computer science degree, and I'm glad that I did. But I must say that what I didn't really learn anything fundamentally new in a computer science degree, other than what I'd basically already learned myself over the years. But it was a means to an end, because I wanted to do my master's in computer science, and I'm currently busy with my PhD, and I wouldn't have been allowed to do that if I didn't have the computer science degree. But don't let the lack of a degree hold you back. There's more than enough reading material out there for to teach yourself. At the end of the day, it's just understanding that there are these skill gaps that you need to potentially fill, and you need to read outside maybe of your comfort zone. So go read a book, criminal justice book on investigative techniques, or go and read an introduction to law textbook, or go and read a book on networking, or a book on programming, or something along those lines, and practice the skills. And that generally is very useful in helping cover that aspect.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Jason, for your great presentation, which helps bring this to the SANS community. What was that? Go ahead.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And like I said, if anybody has got questions that haven't been answered, please, send me a message on Twitter, drop me an email. I will happily answer absolutely every single and all questions that are asked.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, awesome. To our audience, thank you so much for listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.